about the behavioral sciences, in addition to more about economics and policy and so forth, that means I'm doing what I can, but it also means I have to collaborate more. And that being an effective collaborator and listening to people who might not share all of my religious biases, but we share, for example, an interest in social welfare, and are willing to admit that sometimes social welfare and conservation are in conflict with one another. But we think about these trade-offs. If we have two resources like biological diversity and economic income, sometimes there's a trade-off there, and we need to be clear about it. And lack of clarity, again, is the problem. In saying we have these win-win and win-win-win situations, often, for at least some of the people who are involved, they're not win-win situations. They're win-lose or lose-lose. And so just being clear about it, so you're not selling something that actually is to the potential buyer's disadvantage. So those plantation managers in the Southeast or in eucalyptus plantations in Brazil or whatever, they're putting fertilizer on their plantations, and that increases growth rates, which increases profits. They're paying taxes, they're hiring workers, and so forth. And so that's all positive. On the negative side, some of those fertilizers are getting up into the atmosphere, getting down into the aquifer, getting into water bodies. As the plantations expand, they do so at the expense of natural ecosystems, including forests and savannas, grasslands, and so forth. But okay, society needs to make these decisions of where that should happen. And it certainly shouldn't happen on the margins of rivers or on steep slopes that are prone to erosion. So having a landscape view rather than a particular stand here, I mean, if you're on level ground, on deep soil, close to a road, it's unlikely that strict conservation is going to be very attractive to people who are deciding the fate of that landscape. But if you're in a remote area, on steep ground, on the edges of a river, then maybe you can negotiate with these trade-offs in mind and protect some of that forest.
I think,
but again, it depends on this clarity about what are the trade-offs and what is forest and what are you trying to save and why are you trying to save it?
Yeah, I think when a lot of people I talked to in the beginning, when they're being exposed to conservation and forests and why to protect the importance, you think about forests in the sort of an absence of people, that you just do something that to protect the forest and you do that. But to get to that level, you have to go through different stakeholders. You have to interact with the community, with landowners, private owners. In California, all this big mess between the urban and more the sort of the forests that are just nearby, increasing the risk of fires. Anyways, and then when you go to the tropics, there are millions and millions of people living in these forested regions who depend on the natural resources as well. So every action you take, it will impact different interests, and it's a bit more complex than we want it to be, right?
Yeah, I wanted the problems to be ecological because I'm an ecologist, but the challenges and the problems are way more often social and economic. We do still need ecological insights, but I think the ability to communicate those trade-offs is really important. I mean, in California, the idea that you can protect forests and just leave them alone is part of the problem because, without frequent low intensity fires in some parts of your landscape, the forest gets very dense. And so when it does burn, the fires are cataclysmic and unstoppable. But that means going in and doing like mechanical thinning, cutting trees, harvesting trees. Well, wait a second, this is supposed to be a protected area. What are you doing going in there harvesting trees? Well, we're protecting it. That's what we're doing. But yeah, so often that's been done in ways that were profit maximizing and not benefit maximizing in terms of all the benefits. So it's understandable why people hear chainsaws and they want to call the police, because chainsaws do us a lot of damage. On the other hand, if you have fire susceptible areas, sometimes thinning is what's needed. I've been working recently in Northern Australia, where in the tropical rainforest of Australia, it's in Northern Queensland, it's a spectacular area. In the late 1980s, all logging was stopped by the federal government, not the state government, the federal government. And in some ways that's great. But they were doing pretty careful logging, but okay. They stopped logging and the forest got transferred from the Forest Authority to the Parks Authority. But Parks Authority has no source of income. And so now this forest is getting overrun with European boars and wild hogs like we have in the Southeast as well, and exotic invasive species like lantana just taking over. And there's not the management authority to do the management. And so this idea that a forest is self-sufficient and doesn't require any kind of management is often wrong. But on the other hand, we need to be really careful when we do intervene. And for that, we do need the input of ecologists as well as the economists and the social scientists. But we also need the communicators that can explain these complicated situations to the public so that every intervention isn't blocked by public protest. And some of those interventions should be blocked, but we need an informed public. And that takes this interdisciplinary approach to forest conservation and conservation of other ecosystems. But I must say, in this world of arborealized conservation agendas, it's a lot easier to argue for the protection of forest than it is for the protection of savanna. And that's just the way it is. But to go back to the original question, in writing that paper, it was fascinating to go deep into the history of this language, the English language, but also other Romance languages, and look at where the word forest or selva comes from. But forest in particular was just the land beyond the village boundary. It didn't have anything to do with whether it was tree covered or meadow or anything else. It was just out there. It's a place you don't want to be. And in Northern European culture in particular, forests were dangerous. They had wolves and bears, and before that, saber-toothed tigers and whatever, and brigands and bad people, and you can hide there. And so forests are culturally really all just confusing in what is forest and what is not. So maybe the effort that Kent Redford and I made to clarify this terminology was we were overreaching, because from the beginning, what is and what is not forest was always confusing and context dependent. And so the best we can hope for is clarity, again, clarifying what it is that you mean and what constitutes a forest. The problem is with those sound bites about reforestation, for example, nobody's being particularly clear about what the forest is that's being restored, and what would constitute success in that regard. And trees are good in the right place, and the right tree in the right place is great, but there are also places where you don't want that to happen. And I agree with Paulo that, wow, we're investing huge amounts in reforestation at the same time that deforestation and forest degradation are continuing. unabated in many places. And so it's a lot easier to prevent destruction than it is to restore. Restoration also provides a redemptive opportunity for the destroyers. Oh, we're going to destroy this forest or this savanna, but we can restore it afterwards. I mean, that's the story with mine spoils and so forth, but nobody's successfully done that, not to my standard of looking at biological diversity. It might have biomass, it might have stopped heavy erosion, but it doesn't have all the species that I would want to see in a forest. It's better than an eroding, hillside, but it's still not what we lost. And so protection, responsible management is always going to be way more cost effective than reforestation, and especially dangerous when reforestation happens in places where there wasn't forest before.
Or because you don't want to stop few emissions, right? Anthropogenic carbon emissions.
Yeah, and since when I started really working on forests for reduced emissions back in the early 90s, I was strongly criticized by friends and colleagues in the climate change abatement community who didn't want to include forests in any climate change agendas because they wanted to stop emissions from fossil fuels. And they said, well, God, if you propose, I was working on reduced impact logging, but the reforestation is the same way. Well, if we can sequester carbon by planting trees or improving logging practices, then wow, we can continue to drive our Hummers or burn coal to fuel our electric cars or whatever it is, and continue this really wasteful lifestyle. And we have a redemptive opportunity, which is in the forest. So it's with some hesitation that I continue to push improve forest management for climate change mitigation, but it's one of the few tools in my toolbox. And whereas there is money floating around for carbon sequestration and climate change mitigation, there isn't much available for biological diversity conservation. So the pendulum will swing, and maybe people will accept the value of toucans and hornbills and gibbons and howler monkeys, but until they do, we'll use what we have, and the carbon climate change mitigation tool is one of the few we have in our toolbox. Savannas, though, if you can plant trees in savannas and convert them into plantations that look like forests, that's great for climate change mitigation, but it's not very good for giant anteaters and armadillos and all those savanna organisms.
Yeah, so Jack, I think it's great. The students who asked 3 questions after watching the video. So I'll let you know what the questions they have are about. And also they have to come up with 12 words that come to mind when you think about forests. And then they have to, I'm going to trick them, now they know, to develop a monitoring system across the globe using some of those words as the basis. And so thank you very much. And if you have anything else to say to the students, and that's great.
No, keep thinking, keep reading. I look forward to hearing your questions. Thanks, Paulo.